Hello, everyone. My husband? Oh, David? He wouldn't dare make a fuss if he found out about the affair, Amelia said, waving off the thought as if it were a minor inconvenience. Her confidence was almost unsettling, an air of arrogance that hinted at complete disregard for the potential consequences. But if those who strayed could only glimpse the storm brewing in the shadows, maybe they'd think twice before playing such a dangerous game. Greetings, viewer. Imagine this: 37 years of marriage, only to be blindsided by betrayal. 37 years, a whole lifetime invested, tossed aside for a fleeting thrill. It's not just reckless, it's tragic. And yet, here we are, diving into the aftermath of such deceit. David's response? Let's just say it's one for the books. Stick around to witness the fallout, and hey, don't forget to subscribe for more tales like this. Let's get started. Amelia, you're treading on thin ice. If David uncovers what you've been hiding, it'll all come crashing down, Rachel said, leaning forward with a furrowed brow, her voice laced with concern. The kitchen was unnervingly quiet, the ticking clock amplifying the tension like a countdown to disaster. Amelia leaned back against the counter, her wine glass poised casually in her hand, exuding a nonchalant confidence that only deepened Rachel's unease. "You're overthinking this," Amelia said with a sly grin, taking a measured sip of wine. "David's too caught up in his work to notice anything. We barely even speak these days." Her tone was calm, detached, too detached, and it sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. Rachel traced the rim of her coffee mug as unease coursed through her. Could Amelia truly not see the precarious tightrope she was walking? Or was she simply too intoxicated by the thrill to care? Amelia, secrets like this have a way of unraveling fast. David may be patient, but no one's patience lasts forever. Amelia's expression hardened, her voice turning cold. "You're making too much out of this," she replied dismissively, waving off Rachel's warnings as if they were inconsequential. "I have everything under control." A faint smile curved her lips, daring and self-assured. "And besides," she added, her voice softening as she mentioned him, "Jason's worth it. He's nothing like David. He's exciting." Rachel sighed, her gaze drifting to the amber hues of the sunset beyond the window. She had seen Amelia's marriage slowly fray over time. David wasn't a bad husband. He was steady and dependable, always a solid presence. But that reliability had become the very thing Amelia resented, a monotony she yearned to escape. And Jason, with his energy and charm, was her escape route. "I get it, Amelia," Rachel said quietly, her voice heavy with understanding. "David's not giving you what you need anymore. But this is reckless. You're playing with fire, and I don't think you see how close the flames are." The laugh that escaped Amelia was soft but hollow. "Dangerous?" she repeated, as if testing the word. "David won't do anything. If he finds out, maybe it'll finally give him the push to leave. I wouldn't mind some freedom." Rachel's eyes widened in shock. "Do you even hear yourself?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're talking about throwing away your life with David, 37 years, like it's just a passing thought." Amelia shrugged again, this time with an indifference that cut deeper. "Maybe it is," she said flatly. "I'm tired of pretending everything's fine. Jason makes me feel alive again, something I haven't felt in years." Rachel leaned forward, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "And what about Jason? Do you really think he's a forever kind of guy? What happens when the thrill fades, just like it did with David?" For a moment, Amelia stared into her glass, watching the wine swirl as if it held the answers. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I'll deal with it when the time comes." "Amelia," Rachel said, her voice firm, "just be careful. David might seem calm and composed, but everyone has a breaking point. Push him too far, and you won't like what happens." Amelia laughed, but the sound lacked conviction. "I'm not afraid of David," she said, though a faint tremor in her voice betrayed her. "He's not the type to lose control. He'll be upset, sure, but he'll get over it." Rachel didn't respond immediately, her silence speaking volumes as Amelia took another sip of wine, her confidence masking the deep uncertainty beneath. As Rachel stood, The soft clink of her coffee cup against the table punctuated the silence. She reached for her jacket, her expression heavy with resignation. "I just hope you know what you're doing," she said quietly. "You need to realize that things like this rarely end without consequences." Amelia followed her to the door, her confident smile unwavering as she tried to reassure her friend. "I've thought it all through," she replied firmly. "I'm ready for whatever happens." But as Rachel stepped out into the crisp evening air, she hesitated and turned back. Her gaze lingered on Amelia, her face etched with unease. Something about this didn't sit right. The storm Amelia refused to acknowledge felt closer than either of them dared admit. "If you're not careful, this whole thing could collapse," Rachel had cautioned one last time. Yet Amelia's expression didn't so much as flicker. She stood steady, composed, untouched by uncertainty. "Don't worry, Rachel. I've got it all under control. Just trust me," she had said, her voice cool and assured. From the doorway, Amelia watched Rachel disappear into the night. She exhaled, shutting the door behind her, and wandered back into the kitchen. The warmth of the wine coursed through her, a pleasant buzz that muted her nagging doubts. Setting her half-full glass on the counter, her fingers instinctively reached for her phone. A quick scroll brought Jason's name to the screen, and the sight of his photo sent a familiar thrill racing through her. Without hesitation, she tapped out a message. "Thinking about you. Can't wait for tomorrow." The response came almost instantly. The typing bubble danced briefly before his reply appeared. "Miss you too. Tomorrow can't come fast enough." Her heart raced, a grin spreading across her face. She typed back, "Same time, same place?" His answer was swift, "Of course." The rush of secrecy and forbidden excitement surged through her, a feeling that had been missing for years. Yet as Amelia leaned against the counter, a faint unease crept in, dimming her exhilaration. Rachel's words echoed faintly, warning of the risks she'd dismissed so casually. What if David found out? She had been careful, methodical even. No obvious signs, no missteps. But David wasn't oblivious. If he ever suspected, he'd leave no stone unturned to uncover the truth. Shaking her head to dispel the thought, Amelia refused to let worry spoil her evening. She had things under control. Keeping her lives separate was simply a matter of discipline. She poured another glass of wine and retreated to the living room, sinking into the comfort of the couch. The house was quiet save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. David, as usual, was still at work, likely locked in another endless meeting. Did he notice the distance between them? Or was he, in some way, relieved by it? Her phone buzzed again, drawing her attention. Another message from Jason. "I was thinking, what if we went away for the weekend? Just us. Leave everything behind for a few days." The idea was tantalizing, and her pulse quickened at the thought of escaping her crumbling marriage for a brief, indulgent getaway. But the logistics made her hesitate. A trip like that would be difficult to conceal, nearly impossible to explain. Her fingers hovered over the screen, caught between desire and caution. The low rumble of the garage door startled her, snapping her out of her thoughts. David was home. In an instant, she flipped her phone face down on the coffee table and grabbed the TV remote. With practiced ease, she began flipping through channels, arranging her expression into one of casual relaxation. By the time David entered the living room, she looked the picture of calm. "You're home early," she said lightly, her tone as nonchalant as she could muster. "The meeting ended sooner than expected," he replied, his voice neutral as his gaze flickered over her. He barely paused before heading toward the kitchen, his footsteps measured but deliberate. Something about his demeanor felt different. The realization unsettled her. From her seat on the couch, she listened to him move around the kitchen. Her thoughts churned. Does he know? Did I miss something? Upstairs, the faint glow from David's office seeped under the door. He sat hunched over his laptop, his face illuminated by the harsh white light of the screen. It was late, long past midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. His bloodshot eyes scanned through line after line of Amelia's bank statements. Restaurant bills, hotel charges, expenses from places he'd never been. On nights Amelia had claimed to be out with friends. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The knot in David's stomach grew tighter with every passing second, each click of the mouse pulling him deeper into a reality he didn't want to face. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the touchpad, his breath shallow. Steeling himself, he opened her messages, having long since learned how to access her accounts without her ever suspecting. He exhaled slowly, knowing that whatever he found next would be irreversible. The messages were damning. Thread after thread of private conversations, hiding in plain sight. The contact name was clever, Linda Michael, a deceptively innocent cover. But David wasn't fooled. There was no Linda, and these messages were far from innocent. He clicked on a recent thread, his breath hitching as the words stared back at him. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Same place." The response came just seconds later. "Of course. Already missing you. Jason." David muttered the name under his breath, tasting the bitterness of it like acid on his tongue. He recognized the name. It had appeared in fragments before, in deleted messages or fleeting mentions that Amelia had brushed off with a laugh. He already knew who Jason was. Younger, flashier, the kind of charm David had never thought to cultivate. Jason was a real estate agent from the office next door, the man who'd slipped into the cracks of David's marriage while he worked late, sacrificing hours of his life to provide the very comfort Amelia seemed desperate to escape. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as the truth pressed down on him like a heavy weight. He had known their marriage was strained. Who wouldn't after so many years? But this was something he hadn't prepared for. It wasn't just a crack in their relationship. It was a chasm, and he could see no way to bridge it. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts swirling. For months, he'd been trying to figure out where they had gone wrong. Was it the long hours? The missed dinners? He wasn't blind to his flaws. He knew he wasn't perfect, but none of it justified this. Amelia's betrayal wasn't a symptom of their problems. It was a dagger aimed straight at the heart of everything they had built together. The signs had been there all along, and now he could see them clearly. Her late-night girls' nights out, the sudden enthusiasm for weekend trips with friends he barely knew, the growing distance between them that no amount of effort on his part could seem to close. He had even asked her once if something was wrong. Amelia had laughed, kissed him lightly on the cheek, and told him not to worry. Yet her smile hadn't reached her eyes, and the memory of that fleeting shadow now cut deeper than he could have imagined. Sitting alone in the dim light of his office, the realization settled over him like a storm cloud. Amelia had been unfaithful. David shot out of his chair, pacing the room as his fists clenched and unclenched. His entire life had been a study in control, in measured responses no matter how high the stakes. But now, he could feel that control slipping. The urge to confront her, to march downstairs and demand answers, roared inside him like a wildfire. Yet another part of him held back. He needed a plan. He needed clarity. The vibration of his phone on the desk broke through his storm of thoughts. He turned to see a message from Amelia. "Hey, are you working late again? Just checking in. Love you." David stared at the screen, his lip curling in disgust. "Love you." The hypocrisy of those words was almost laughable. How could she write them after spending the evening with someone else? He set the phone down, unable to muster a reply, and sank back into his chair. The weight of what he discovered pinned him in place. What was next? A confrontation? A quiet exit? The future that once seemed so secure now stretched before him, vast and unknowable. His mind wandered back to the beginning, to when they were young and full of hope. He remembered the laughter they had shared, the promises whispered in the dark. What had gone so wrong? While he'd been working toward their future, Amelia had turned her attention elsewhere, chasing a spark he hadn't even realized had gone out. With a deep sigh, David turned back to his laptop, opening the folder he'd been compiling for weeks. Photos, text messages, bank statements. Every damning piece of evidence meticulously gathered and cataloged. Dinner reservations at restaurants he'd never been to. Charges for hotels on nights she was supposedly out with friends. The picture they painted wasn't one of a fleeting mistake. This was no momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, ongoing affair. Jason. The name echoed in David's mind like a cruel taunt. "You think this is all going to work out for you? Don't you? He muttered, his voice low and seething. His anger simmered beneath the surface, steady and unrelenting. But the rage wasn't only reserved for Jason. It was Amelia's betrayal, the person he'd trusted most, that cut the deepest. She had orchestrated her deception right under his nose, and he'd been blind to it. His eyes drifted to a photograph on the screen. Amelia and Jason at a dimly lit restaurant. They were smiling, leaning in close. Her hand rested lightly on his, a touch that once felt so familiar but now seemed entirely foreign. The sight of it turned David's stomach. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 a.m. Amelia would be fast asleep by now, blissfully unaware that her intricate web of lies was beginning to collapse. David closed the laptop slowly, with an eerie calm, and leaned back in his chair, the silence of the room pressing in around him. He wasn't ready for a confrontation. Not yet. This wasn't just an infidelity. It was a challenge, an open defiance of everything they'd built together. If she thought she could win this game, she didn't know David as well as she thought. He was a man who never rushed, who played the long game and always came out ahead. He would wait, letting Amelia believe she still had control, all the while positioning himself 2 steps ahead. Picking up his phone, David read her last text again. "Hey, are you working late again? Just checking in. Love you." With deliberate precision, he typed back, "Love you too." Then he set the phone down and allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. Later that evening, the jingling of keys broke the heavy silence of the house. Amelia stepped inside, kicking off her shoes as she always did, the dim light of the living room her only greeting. David sat in the armchair, his posture relaxed, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand. The amber liquid swirled lazily, half drained. He wasn't watching TV, reading, or scrolling through his phone. He just sat there, staring down at his drink like it held the answers to unspoken questions. "David," she called softly, pausing just inside the doorway. Something about the scene made her stomach twist. He didn't respond right away. When his eyes finally lifted to meet hers, they were sharp, almost predatory, their intensity making her skin prickle. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone calm and measured, but carrying an unmistakable edge. Amelia hesitated, her smile faltering for just a moment before she recovered. "It was fine. Nothing out of the ordinary." "How about you?" she replied, keeping her tone light and casual as she stepped further into the room. David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finally set the glass on the side table, the sound seemed to resonate louder than it should have. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice low. "I've been doing some thinking. About us. About the choices we've made." "What are you talking about, David?" Amelia asked, her voice tinged with irritation, though her hands fidgeted at her sides. David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze piercing and unyielding. "Do you think you're clever, Amelia?" he asked softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Do you really think you can keep up this charade without paying the price?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her arms crossing defensively. Her tone was firm, but her pulse quickened. She knew exactly what he was referring to. She just wasn't ready to admit it. David's expression darkened as he stood, his movements deliberate. The sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor seemed deafening in the otherwise silent room. He stopped a few feet from her, setting his empty glass on the mantel with a practiced calm. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. "I know, Amelia," he said finally, his voice hard. "About Jason. About every lie you've told." "David," she began, her voice faltering. He silenced her with a sharp gesture. "You told me to stay out of it, didn't you?" he said, taking another step closer. His presence felt suffocating now, the air around her seeming to thicken. "Well, guess what? I didn't listen." Her knees felt weak, and the walls of the room seemed to close in around her. "David, please," she whispered, her voice trembling, but her plea fell on deaf ears. His expression was unyielding, a mixture of fury and cold determination. He wasn't interested in excuses. Not anymore. Now just inches from her, David's voice dropped to a chilling whisper, the menace unmistakable. You thought I wouldn't find out? That you could humiliate me and walk away as if nothing happened? His voice rose slightly, his carefully maintained composure fracturing under the weight of his fury. You made your choice, Amelia, and now you'll live with the consequences. Amelia's mind reeled as she tried to grasp the full weight of his words. She had underestimated him, dismissing him as too preoccupied with work to notice the widening cracks in their marriage. But now, as she stared into his cold, unrelenting gaze, the realization struck like a lightning bolt. She had been wrong. Horribly wrong. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear. David turned slowly, walking to the window and staring out at the still, dark street. His tone was unnervingly calm when he spoke again. "I want to meet him," he said. "Jason, your little secret." Amelia's breath caught. "You," she began, but he cut her off sharply. "Oh, we've already met," he said, his tone dripping with mock reassurance. "And let's just say Jason won't be a problem anymore." Panic surged through her veins. She took a step closer, her voice rising with desperation. "What did you do, David?" He turned back to her, and a slow, almost sinister smile curved his lips. "I did what needed to be done," he said, his voice steady and emotionless. "He's out of the picture." Amelia's stomach churned, her entire body trembling as her mind raced with possibilities. Had he threatened Jason? Hurt him? Or worse? You couldn't have," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "It doesn't matter now," David replied with chilling detachment. "What matters is this game of yours is over." Amelia stood frozen, her breath shallow, waiting for him to say more. David turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable, but his eyes as hard as steel. "You made your bed, Amelia. Now you'll lie in it." "David, please," she began, her voice cracking as the words caught in her throat. She wanted to apologize, to tell him it was all a mistake. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't change anything. David shook his head slowly. "No more lies," he said. "I'm done with all of it." He set his glass on the table with a sharp, deliberate clink that echoed in the heavy silence. "I've had enough." Her voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "What are you going to do?" David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he strode past her, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Pausing at the bottom of the stairs, he glanced back over his shoulder. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. And then he was gone, leaving Amelia standing in the suffocating silence, her mind spinning with dread. For weeks, David had watched and waited, biding his time as he pieced together every detail. Jason's routine, his habits, his vulnerabilities. Like Amelia, Jason had thought himself untouchable, but David saw through them both. He always had. When the evening came, David knew it was time to act. Tonight, his focus was singular: Jason. The drive to Jason's apartment was silent, the low hum of the engine steadying David's thoughts. He parked a block away, slipping into the shadows as he approached the building on foot. He moved quietly, his steps purposeful, blending into the dim light like a predator closing in on its prey. David had prepared for this moment. He knew Jason's schedule, knew he'd be arriving home soon. He took up position near the entrance, concealed by a line of parked cars, and waited. It wasn't long before Jason's car pulled up. David remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on the vehicle as the engine quieted and the headlights dimmed. The driver's door opened, and Jason stepped out, oblivious to the presence lurking nearby. He moved with casual ease, his hand fumbling in his pocket for his keys. "You must be Jason," David said, his voice cutting through the night with a calm, lethal precision. Jason froze mid-motion, his hand hovering near the lock. Slowly, he turned, his face shifting from mild confusion to irritation as he peered into the shadows. "Who are you?" he demanded, his tone sharp but unsteady. David stepped forward into the faint light, his expression unreadable but his eyes unyielding. "I'm Amelia's husband," he said, the words sharp and deliberate. The impact was immediate. Jason's face drained of color, his jaw slackening as the realization struck. He stood motionless, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. David took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. Jason scrambled for his phone, his hand trembling as he fished it out of his pocket. Whatever false confidence he'd carried was gone now, replaced by palpable fear. David moved with predatory precision, anticipating Jason's desperate attempt to call for help. Before Jason could unlock the screen, David closed the distance in 2 swift strides, knocking the phone from his hand with a sharp, deliberate motion. The device hit the pavement with a shattering crack, the sound cutting through the still night like a warning bell. "Think you're clever, don't you?" David growled, his voice low and venomous. "You thought you could sneak around with my wife and I'd never know?" Jason stumbled backward, his confidence crumbling under David's unyielding stare. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice faltering with fear. "Don't insult me," David snapped, seizing Jason by the collar and slamming him hard against the wall. The force of the impact reverberated through Jason's body, leaving him gasping for air. "I've seen the texts, the calls, the little notes you thought were so clever. I know everything." Jason's eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. He was pinned, trapped by David's cold fury. It wasn't just the physical force that left him paralyzed. It was the calculated control, the absence of blind rage. This was something far more terrifying. "Please," Jason choked out, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "You didn't mean?" David interrupted, leaning in closer until their faces were inches apart. His voice dropped to a deadly whisper, each word laced with ice. "You didn't mean to destroy my life? To humiliate me? Or did you just think I wouldn't notice?" Jason stammered incoherently, his fear palpable. David's grip tightened, his presence overwhelming. "You made a choice," he hissed, his voice cutting like a blade. "And now you'll deal with the fallout." Before Jason could respond, David released him, but only for an instant. With brutal efficiency, he drove a fist into Jason's stomach, the blow doubling him over with a choked gasp. Jason collapsed to his knees, clutching his midsection, but David wasn't done. He hauled Jason upright by the back of his shirt and slammed him against the wall again, the sound echoing in the empty street. "You thought you could take everything from me," David growled, his voice steady but seething with fury. "Everything I built, everything I cared about. And you thought you'd just walk away like it was nothing?" Jason groaned, his trembling hands rising feebly in defense. But David's strikes were calculated, each one measured and precise. A savage blow to Jason's face sent him crumpling to the ground, blood trickling from his nose as he gasped for breath. "Please," Jason rasped weakly, his voice barely audible. "I didn't." "You didn't think," David spat, his tone sharp enough to cut. "You didn't think I'd find out. You didn't think there'd be consequences. But here we are." Jason's body slumped against the wall, his strength completely drained. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto David, who leaned in close, his voice dropping to an icy calm that was more chilling than his blows. "You're leaving town tonight," David said evenly. "If I ever see you again." He left the threat unfinished, the weight of it hanging heavily in the air. Jason nodded frantically, his body trembling as he gasped for air. David straightened, brushing off his hands as if discarding a nuisance. He looked down at Jason, his expression devoid of emotion. "That was your warning," he said coldly. "Next time, you won't get one." Without another word, David turned and walked away, his steps steady and unhurried. Behind him, Jason remained crumpled on the ground, broken and trembling, a shadow of the man who had once thought himself untouchable. The vibrating buzz of her phone dragged Amelia from restless sleep. She groaned, her hand fumbling across the nightstand until it found the device. Without glancing at the screen, she pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy and unnerving. Then a voice spoke, calm, deliberate, and with an urgency that made her sit upright. "Mrs. Davis?" Her eyes snapped open, the haze of sleep vanishing in an instant. Something in the tone, a restrained gravity, made her heart pound. Yes, this is Amelia, she replied, her voice now sharp with apprehension. This is the hospital, the voice said, professional yet solemn. We need you to come to the emergency room right away. There's been an incident. Her chest tightened as panic clawed its way in. Is it David? She asked, desperation creeping into her words. The possibility of it being her husband gave her an odd, fleeting hope. If it was David, perhaps this could be the reprieve she'd been craving, a way out of the suffocating tension of their collapsing marriage. There was a pause, long enough to make her breath hitch. Then came the reply, no, it's Jason. He's been seriously injured. You need to get here as soon as possible. The words struck her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Jason, she whispered, barely able to speak his name. Her mind raced as her stomach twisted violently. What happened? She managed to ask, her voice trembling. The voice on the other end hesitated. His injuries are severe. The doctors are doing everything they can, but you need to come immediately. Her thoughts spiraled out of control. Could David have had a hand in this? The possibility clawed at her, unbidden yet undeniable. A wave of terror surged through her as she shoved back the covers and stumbled to her feet. Her movements were frantic, her fingers clumsy as she fumbled with the buttons of her shirt, every wasted second dragging like an eternity. The drive to the hospital blurred into a surreal haze of dim streetlights and deserted roads. Amelia barely registered starting the car or steering through intersections. Her thoughts were consumed by Jason. His laugh, the way he had rekindled a spark she thought was long extinguished. And now, he was fighting for his life, and she had no answers. She screeched into the hospital parking lot, barely remembering to shut off the engine before bolting through the sliding doors. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached the reception desk. Jason, she stammered, struggling to recall his last name through the fog of panic. I'm here for Jason. The nurse behind the desk gave her a sympathetic look. Room 210, third floor. The doctors are still with him, but you can go in. Without waiting for more, Amelia rushed to the elevator. Her hands trembled as she jabbed at the button, the metallic walls closing in as she rose. The quiet hum of the machinery filled the silence, each second dragging unbearably. Questions churned in her mind, colliding with the dread she couldn't shake. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the cold sterility of the hospital hallway. Room 210 loomed ahead, the door slightly ajar. Amelia hesitated, her breath catching as her steps faltered. Summoning her courage, she reached out and pushed the door open. The sight before her stole the strength from her legs. Jason lay motionless on the hospital bed, his face swollen and unrecognizable beneath a patchwork of bruises and bandages. Tubes and wires stretched from his battered body to machines that beeped and hissed in an unsettling rhythm. His eyes were swollen shut, his head wrapped in a blood-stained bandage. The vibrant, confident man she had known was now a broken shell, a shadow of himself under the stark hospital lights. Amelia staggered to the chair beside his bed, collapsing into it as her knees buckled. Her stomach churned, nausea threatening to overwhelm her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What did they do to you?" Jason didn't stir. His hand was limp and cold as she grasped it, searching for any sign of life. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let her grief spill over. For now, all she could do was sit there, staring at the shattered man before her mind screaming with unanswered questions and unspoken fears. The creak of the door snapped Amelia out of her spiraling thoughts. She turned quickly, her heart racing, to see a doctor stepping into the room. His face, weary and lined with exhaustion, spoke of long nights and the burden of tending to suffering he couldn't always alleviate. He glanced briefly at her before focusing on the chart at the foot of Jason's bed. "Mrs. Davis?" he asked softly. Amelia nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to form words. The doctor sighed heavily, closing the chart with a quiet snap before meeting her gaze. His eyes held a careful mix of sympathy and professionalism, the kind of balance that came from years of delivering difficult news. "He's stable for now, but his injuries are severe. We're doing everything we can, but his recovery will be long and uncertain. The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow, leaving her struggling to breathe. She had expected anger from David, maybe even a confrontation. But this level of brutality was beyond anything she had imagined. Her voice was barely a whisper when she asked, "Who did this?" The doctor's expression darkened, his response careful. "The police are investigating," he said. "It was a violent assault. When he regains consciousness, we're hoping he'll be able to provide more information, assuming he's able to speak." Amelia barely heard the rest of his words. The reality of what had happened wrapped around her like a crushing weight, her guilt and fear blending into a suffocating fog. She sat there in silence, her eyes fixed on Jason's battered body, time slipping past unnoticed. Eventually, her legs trembling beneath her, she stood and left the hospital. The night air was sharp and cold against her skin, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts spiraled in chaotic loops, her mind racing to make sense of what had happened. David had found Jason. But how? And what exactly had he done? When she finally returned home, the house was steeped in silence, the darkness oppressive. She tossed her keys onto the counter and drifted into the kitchen, her movements aimless. Her mind still whirled with questions when her eyes landed on something that froze her in place. A single sheet of paper lay on the table, conspicuous and deliberate. Her hands trembled as she approached, her heart pounding in her chest. She picked it up slowly, the scrawled handwriting unmistakably David's. "Cheater, this is only the beginning." Her legs gave out, and she sank into a chair, the paper shaking in her grasp. The venom in those few words sent a jolt of terror through her. Panic clawed at her as she began to piece together what had happened. She bolted up, running to their bedroom and yanking open the closet. His side was empty. The shoes that had once lined the floor were gone, the drawers stripped bare. Even the faint scent of his cologne had vanished. David was gone. Frantically, she tore through the house, searching for any trace of him, any indication that he might return. But her search only confirmed the truth. Their joint bank accounts had been drained. Her jewelry, every piece, was gone. David had erased himself from their life with chilling precision, leaving behind nothing but his final message. Amelia sank back into the chair, her body trembling as the enormity of her loss set in. The money, the house, David, everything was gone, swept away in a calculated act of vengeance. Days blurred into weeks, Amelia moving like a ghost through the remnants of her life. She rarely left the house, ignoring the constant calls and knocks of worried friends and family. Even Rachel, who had come by repeatedly, couldn't coax her out of her isolation. Everything Amelia had believed was hers, her stability, her identity, had crumbled to nothing. The only time she ventured out was to visit the hospital. Those visits, once her only solace, soon became a source of unbearable pain. Jason, though stabilized, was a shadow of his former self. His injuries had left permanent scars, both physical and emotional, and the man who had once reignited a spark in her life now served as a haunting reminder of everything she had lost. One afternoon, Amelia stood just outside Jason's hospital room, her hand hovering over the door. She hadn't seen him since that night, the night David had carried out his retribution. The nurse's words echoed in her mind. "He's recovering, but it's slow. The road ahead is uncertain." Her hand faltered as doubt consumed her. Did she even have the strength to face him now? Taking a deep breath, Amelia rapped softly on the door, her heart heavy with guilt and dread. What could she say? What was left to say? The door creaked slightly as it opened, and Jason's hollow eyes lifted from the bed. They were distant now, colder than she had ever seen, and in them, she saw nothing but a world of hurt she had created. His voice, strained and gravelly, cut through the silence. "What are you doing here?" Amelia hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The weight of his question pressed down on her like a leaden cloak, suffocating her. She took a tentative step forward, unsure if anything she could say could begin to heal the chasm she had caused. "Jason, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff. "I never wanted this to happen." Jason let out a sharp, bitter laugh that quickly twisted into a grimace of pain. He winced, clutching his side as he caught his breath. Didn't want this? He hissed, his tone thick with sarcasm. What exactly did you think was going to happen, Amelia? Did you really think we could play with fire and not get burned? His words struck her like a slap across the face. Amelia's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away, clinging to the fragile hope that somehow she could reach him. I didn't know David would go this far, she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her remorse. I couldn't have. Stop, Jason cut her off sharply, his voice cold and unforgiving. I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want your apologies, and I sure as hell don't want your pity. His words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. Because of you, I've lost everything. My job, my reputation, my future. He paused, his breathing ragged. Do you think a pathetic sorry can fix any of that? Amelia took a step back, each word hitting her like a physical blow. Her hand reached out, bracing herself against the weight of his fury. Jason, please, she pleaded, her voice barely more than a whisper. Leave, he snapped, his voice final, as cold and distant as the space between them. His eyes, filled with nothing but disdain, locked onto hers with a look that left no room for argument. I don't want to see you again, Amelia. It's over. For a moment, she stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer finality of his words. Slowly, painfully, the truth sank in. There was nothing left to say. With trembling legs and a heart hollowed out by her own actions, she turned and walked out, the soft click of the door behind her echoing like a death knell in her chest. It was over. Jason was gone. David was gone. And now, she was utterly and irreversibly alone. In another city, far from the wreckage of Amelia's life, David was thriving. He had taken everything, her money, her jewelry, the last shreds of her dignity, and used it to build a new life for himself. The man who had once lived in the shadows of a dull, suffocating marriage had cast off his old identity like an ill-fitting coat. David's new life was simple, almost deliberately modest. He settled into a small apartment, not flashy but comfortable enough to avoid drawing attention. For him, it wasn't about flaunting his newfound freedom or wealth. It was about the satisfaction of walking away unscathed, leaving Amelia to drown in the wreckage he had so carefully orchestrated. He kept a low profile, blending seamlessly into his new surroundings. A quiet job paid the bills, helping him maintain the anonymity he prized. But even with this new life, David couldn't resist the occasional indulgence. When the mood struck, he would remind Amelia of his presence with calculated cruelty. The first reminder came 10 days after his disappearance. A plain postcard, no return address, arrived at Amelia's door. It was simple, the message written in David's unmistakable handwriting. Miss me yet? Amelia's hands trembled as she held the card. Rage surged through her, and she almost tore it to shreds, but she stopped herself. It was pointless. David was out there somewhere, free, while she was stuck in the ruins of everything he had left behind. The postcards kept coming. Each one felt like a fresh wound, reopening the raw pain of her failures. Some were blank, with only faint smudges of ink. Others carried cryptic, taunting messages that sent shivers down her spine. How's Jason? Or still thinking of me? Each time, the postcards reminded her of the power David still held, even from a distance. Days melted into weeks, weeks into months. Amelia's life became a monotonous cycle of regret, isolation, and quiet suffering. She tried to return to work, but the whispers and furtive glances were unbearable. People knew. They knew about the affair, about Jason's downfall, about David's sudden and dramatic disappearance. Every hushed conversation when she entered a room, every averted glance, screamed their silent judgment. Her friends, one by one, drifted away. Family calls grew curt, the warmth fading with each strained conversation. And Jason, he had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. Her world had collapsed, leaving behind nothing but empty walls, memories she couldn't escape, and the bitter taste of everything she had lost. On rare occasions, Amelia ventured out, mostly to visit Jason. But even those trips became unbearable. Though his condition had stabilized, The man she once knew, vibrant, confident, full of life, was gone. Now, he lay broken, both physically and emotionally, a shattered reflection of her own inner ruin. One afternoon, standing outside his hospital room, Amelia hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. The nurse's words echoed in her mind. He's recovering, but slowly. The injuries were serious. His future is uncertain. Her descent into despair continued, uninterrupted, until one dreary afternoon when a knock shattered the silence of her empty home. The sound startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Most of her remaining acquaintances had stopped trying to contact her long ago. Reluctantly, she opened the door. Standing on the threshold was a man in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a thick folder. His expression was unreadable, his voice brisk and professional. "Amelia Davis?" he asked. She nodded slowly, a fresh wave of dread washing over her. The familiar weight of fear settled deep in her chest. "Yes, that's me," she said, her voice barely audible. Without a word, the man handed her an envelope and turned to leave. Confused and unsettled, Amelia closed the door behind him and retreated into the kitchen. Her hands shook as she tore open the envelope. The bold, cold words at the top of the page hit her like a ton of bricks. Divorce petition? A crushing wave of despair settled over her. She had known this moment would come. David had disappeared months ago, leaving her life in shambles, but seeing it in writing, formal and final, was something she wasn't prepared for. The reality of it felt like a punch to the chest, and she collapsed into the nearest chair, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. She had no money to contest the divorce, no lawyer. But even if she did, what was the point? There was nothing left to fight for. The house was being sold to cover mounting debts. Her savings had long been drained, and she was drowning in unpaid bills. For weeks, she had ignored the tidal wave of expenses, clinging to a faint, irrational hope that something might change. But nothing had changed. Now, David was severing the final thread that tied them together. Days bled into one another as Amelia drifted through the wreckage of her life. She went through the motions, brewing coffee, cleaning, scrolling through job listings. But it all felt hollow. Her actions lacked purpose. Her existence felt meaningless. The romance that had once brought her joy now seemed like a cruel joke. Jason was gone. David was gone. And she was utterly alone, left to face the ruins of her own choices. One evening, Amelia sat at the dimly lit kitchen table, the divorce papers spread before her. She stared at them as if willing them to change, but the words remained cold and unyielding. Her phone rang, breaking the suffocating silence. The number was unfamiliar, but some inexplicable impulse made her answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice flat and drained of emotion. "Amelia," came the voice on the other end, unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat, and her grip tightened around the phone. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her chest constricting. "What do you want?" There was a long pause, the kind that feels like it could stretch on forever. Finally, David's voice broke the silence, calm, but laced with something darker. "I just wanted to make sure you got the papers." Amelia swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I got them," she whispered. Then, after a shaky breath, she asked, "Is this really what you want?" A soft laugh came from the other end, low and sharp, sending a chill down her spine. "It's already done, Amelia. You should be glad I even care enough to check. After everything you did, you're lucky I'm not leaving you with less." His words hit her like a slap, but she held her tongue. He had already taken everything: her money, her home, her pride. There was no fight left in her. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? You've already destroyed everything." David's voice, now laced with an almost cruel calmness, responded. "You don't get to ask that, Amelia. You've done enough damage. You think this is the worst of it? This is just the beginning. I'm done with you." The words were final, cutting through the last of her resolve. With a tremor in her hands, she hung up, the weight of everything she had lost pressing in on her chest like a vice. David's absence was the only certainty left in her life, and even that felt suffocating. Another long pause. When David spoke again, his voice was distant, almost mechanical. "Because I want you to remember," he said, each word deliberate, each one cutting deeper. "I want you to wake up every day knowing this is your fault. You made your choices, and now you'll live with them." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She refused to let him hear her break, to hear the cracks in her composure. "You didn't have to destroy everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David's laugh came again, colder this time, devoid of any trace of warmth. "You destroyed yourself, Amelia. The moment you decided you could lie to me. The divorce? That's just the final touch. Now you're free. Isn't that what you wanted?" His words pierced her, their twisted truth leaving her speechless. In some part of her heart, she had wanted this, a way out, a spark to reignite a life that had gone cold and monotonous. But the cost had been unimaginable. She had thrown everything away, and now she was left with nothing. "Goodbye, Amelia." David's voice was flat, emotionless. "Enjoy your freedom." The line went dead, and Amelia sat there, the phone still clutched in her trembling hand. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating, as if the air itself had grown thick with the weight of everything that had just been said. The months dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The divorce went through without resistance. Amelia signed the papers, each stroke of the pen erasing the remnants of her marriage. She was officially free, but that freedom was an empty shell, a bitter reminder of everything she had lost. David, meanwhile, moved on with his life. He rebuilt, far from the ruins he had left behind. He rarely spared Amelia a thought, and when he did, it was only to remind her of the control he still held over her shattered world. The first postcard arrived shortly after the divorce was finalized. A simple card with 3 mocking words scrawled in his unmistakable handwriting. "Miss me yet?" Amelia's blood boiled when she saw it, but she knew there was no recourse. David was out there, thriving, free, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her own destruction, each shard more painful than the last. The postcards kept coming, each one more cruel than the last. Some were blank, save for a faint smudge of ink. Others carried cryptic, unsettling messages. "How's Jason?" or "Still thinking of me?" Each one was like a fresh wound, reopening the raw pain of what had been lost. It was as if David's shadow loomed over her, never quite gone, always present, even from a distance. Her attempts to rebuild her life felt futile. She returned to work, only to be met with whispers and judgmental stares. Friends vanished, their faces fading into memory. Family grew distant, offering only brief, obligatory conversations. And Jason, he had disappeared entirely. After being discharged from the hospital, he vanished without a trace, taking with him any hope of reconciliation. Their affair had gone public, destroying them both. Amelia's isolation deepened with each passing day. She drifted through her existence, a hollow version of the woman she once was, caught in the ruins of her choices. Then, one fateful afternoon, a knock at the door shattered the oppressive silence. She opened it hesitantly, wondering who could possibly be left to visit her. A man stood there, dressed in a pristine suit, holding a thick folder. His expression was unreadable, his voice brisk and professional. "Amelia Davis?" he asked, his tone formal and distant. "Yes," she answered cautiously, her heart sinking, an unfamiliar dread creeping up her spine. Without saying another word, the man handed her the folder and turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Amelia stood frozen for a moment, staring at the folder, confusion and anxiety rising in her chest. With trembling hands, she closed the door and walked slowly into the kitchen, the weight of the folder pressing down on her. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she scanned the contents. The words at the top of the page were as bold as they were devastating: eviction notice. Her mind spun, her vision blurring as the final blow landed. The house, the last semblance of stability she had clung to, was being taken from her. The walls that had once been her refuge now felt like a trap closing in on her. Amelia sank into the nearest chair, her body numb, the air thick with the oppressive weight of her situation. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel. Bye.